Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Victoria Met's Export Hub Capability Accelerator Program. And today, the first in our market selection series, and we're going to be covering off the market selection basics that you need. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we meet. And for me, this is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I extend my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. And I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Straits Islanders peoples who may be joining us on today's webinar. I'm Collins Rex. I'm the lead for the Victoria Met's Export Hub, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. So let's have a look at what we're going to be covering off today. We're going to be looking at selecting your market, the all-important market research that you need to do, your target market, market entry requirements, and then very importantly today, we're going to be joined by two Met's experts who will be involved in a Q&A session, and we'll be posing a number of questions to our experts, Bob Calvert and Mark Green, and I'll introduce you to them a little bit later on today. Also, if you do have any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A box, and we'll pose them to Mark and Bob when we get to that particular section of today's presentation. So let's get straight into it, shall we? And we start with selecting your market. Of course, when you choose your markets, you do need to do so in a calculated and strategic manner. There really is no point of going at this like a bull at a gate, because if you do, you are not only going to lose time, you're going to lose money, and there's a very good chance that you're going to be selecting the wrong markets. You do need to take into account demographics, of course, but demographics are really a minor component when it comes to what you need to consider and the decisions that you need to make when it comes to selecting your market. So at the very least, there are some questions that you need to ask yourself, and you need to get the appropriate answers. First of all, you need to understand whether there is an actual demand for your product and service, and that means a real demand and not one that you think there may be. You also need to ask yourself, can you afford to sell it in the market that you're considering? Just because the market has a potentially large customer base doesn't mean that that customer base can afford what you are selling. You also need to understand whether you are allowed to sell it in that market. Are there restrictions that forbid you from selling a particular product or service in a particular market, for example? And assuming that you are allowed to sell it there, how are you going to do so? What is your route to market? You also need to ask yourself if you can indeed make it. And that means, can you adapt your product or service to the requirements of your customers in your target market? Can you also make it in sufficient quantities? It's very important that you are able to satisfy the requirements of your market, because if you don't, there's a very good chance that you will not get another chance. And of course, what is the time frame, and can you satisfy that requirement? Also, very importantly, how are you going to get your product into the hands of your customer? How are you going to ship it? What are the freight challenges involved? And if you're delivering a service or you're delivering a technology service online, for example, what is the infrastructure and how are you going to be able to do that? And also, very importantly, once you've sold it, can you actually support it in market? And one of the most important issues of all that you need to wonder about is, how will you be paid? Market research, critical before you consider dipping a toe in a market. It is absolutely crucial to successful market selection, but also to successful export marketing. If you've done the research, you'll know what the product or service is that you need to offer in that particular market. And just because you sell a particular product or service in Australia doesn't mean that that identical one will work in the market of choice. It will also help you to determine the location in that market, because again, Not every location in every market is the same. It's going to help you to plan that all-important sales strategy, and it will help you to understand what motivates buying decisions. So when it comes to market research, there are a few steps involved, and this is something which I think we all so take for granted that we sometimes forget about the steps, and it's really important to remind ourselves. Step number one is really to think about where you might like to do business. And this could be because you have an existing association in a particular market. You might have a connection geographically to that market. You might have a customer in that market who is busy paving the way for you, etc. You might also have an operation in an adjacent market, for example. Secondary market research is very important to do before you go to the next step. And this is where you do all that desk research on your potential market. And of course, we're very fortunate these days. We do have Dr. Google that we can ask. The internet is definitely your friend, provided you understand what it is you're researching and how. And a little bit later on today, we'll give you some resources that you can use to help inform this market research. And then, of course, there is the primary market research, which is where you actually have direct contact with experts, customers, and other sources of information, and that involves market visits. Now, over the past couple of years, this wasn't possible. Of course, we can travel again, and there is really nothing that is quite the same as going to a market, seeing for yourself, and meeting your potential customers face to face. Some of the metrics that you need to be looking at when it comes to market research: of course, demographics and characteristics, very important. The market size, and this is not the population size, we mean the size of potential market for your good or your service. The current demand, and very importantly, also the future demand, because the demand today is not necessarily a guarantee of market tomorrow. What are your internal capabilities? And you really do need to understand this very clearly. What can you do, and what do you need to bring in from outside to help you capitalize on the opportunities in your chosen market? What is the competition doing in that market? And how is that going to affect the way in which you approach the market? Literally, transportation. How are you going to get what you sell into that market? And what is it going to cost you to do that? And how is it going to affect the price that you offer to potential customers? How suitable is your product? And of course, are there any restrictions that forbid you selling into that market, or that make it more difficult for you to do so? How are you going to protect your supply chain? And that means not just from you to your customer, but also from your suppliers to you. And how is geographic location going to affect that? What are the legal requirements? So do you need to set up a business in that market in order to trade in that market? If you engage the services of a distributor, how does that work? And how is the contract going to look that you need to put in place, for example? If you're going down the agency route, what are the implications for you from a legal perspective? Is your agent considered to be your employee, which is very much the case in certain markets? What are those all-important non-tariff barriers? All the things that do not necessarily involve taxes and duties, but that nevertheless give you barriers to entry behind the border. What does your pricing need to look like? And what payment options do you need to extend to customers in that particular market? What is the norm? What are the business practices? And this, of course, is where you can get a great deal of information by going to speak to people in market, or by including the services of an expert consultant. Now, for those of you that are members of the Victoria Export Hub, of course, you have access in 2 markets, in Canada and Peru, to on-the-ground consultants, and you have access to mentors in the form of Bob and Mark, and again, a little bit more about that later. Local support services, language, and here we're not just talking English versus another language, we mean the language of business in that market, the language of mining in that market, the language of METS in that market, and then social and cultural issues. In the met sector, it's very important that you conduct a pestle analysis. So here we're talking about political, economic, socio-cultural, technological, environmental, and legal. And when it comes to political, it is everything from trade policy, not just in that market, but also from the Australian perspective, workplace regulations, whether there is a sanctions regime in place. And of course, if there are sanctions against a particular country, you will almost certainly not be able to sell into that country. Economic, we're talking about gross domestic product, but we're also talking about exchange rates, which may be in your favor or against you. What is the inflation rate like in that country? Sociocultural, how are the spending patterns determined? What are the demographics? What is the gender prevalence? It is probably going to make a difference whether you are selling into a market that is prevailing female as opposed to male, and the way in which you are going to market, for example, the language that you're going to use. When it comes to technology, how is technology being accepted in that market? How is technology rising? And just how old is the technology that is prevalent? And what is the infrastructure available to you to deliver new technologies? Environmental becoming increasingly more important. And here we're talking climate change and pollution. We're also talking natural resources, and we are talking ESG and the demands that are made on you to ensure that you comply. And finally, legal. And here it's trade. We're talking consumer law. We're talking copyright law. Can you protect your intellectual property? Sales contracts. And of course, the presiding law and how that affects things like those sales contracts and the distributor agreements, etc. Now, here's a list of some resources that you might want to consider using to find some of this information, the desk research that you need to do. And we will make this available to you after today, so you don't need to try and write all of these down. Just a couple that I will point out. The first one is the CIA, the World Fact Book. And yes, it is the CIA, but they have a really comprehensive set of data on every country in the world, and they keep it up to date all the time. The World Bank has a vast resource library of reports that you can download for free and all manner of things. And that includes transparency regulations and so forth. And Transparency.org does the same thing. And of course, you can see a whole raft of other resources there. Now, when it comes to your target market, you need to understand who is your target market. So who are your customers in that market? What do those customers want? When do they need it? And where within the target market does what you have to sell best? What works in downtown Lima when you're dealing with a head office, for example, is not going to be the same as what you're going to be selling in Arequipa. Similarly, in Toronto, you are going to have different conversations from the one that you're going to have in Sudbury. So how can your product and your service best be taken to your customers and your target market? When do they want it, and why do they want it? And here it's very important to understand the difference between what they want and what they need, because again, that's going to change the way in which you pitch. What are your customers' expectations, and indeed that market's expectations, regarding after-sales service, maintenance and warranties? Do you have to have a local operation in order to perform all of these functions to their satisfaction? And then, very importantly, what are your competitors doing, and how are you going to compete? Local competitors already in the market, how are they going to react when you attempt to enter, and how will your international competitors respond? Also important to understand that there will almost certainly be disruptive pricing challenges in your market. And this could be because there's pushback against imported products, because local producers might not be very thrilled with you entering. Larger players, of course, are able to cut their prices in order to undercut what you're offering, just so that they can maintain their sales volumes. How will you respond? And we'll be addressing this with our exports later. So a new competitor entering any market could do so with a very compelling pricing strategy. They might put forward products as loss leaders to establish market share. And how does this affect the rate at which you can charge out? Manufacturing and sourcing, of course, always a bit of an interesting conundrum for us, particularly in Australia, which is a high cost base for manufacturing. And we also tend to be quite far from most of our potential markets. All avenues need to be considered when it comes to pricing. And if pricing is a major roadblock, you need to consider the options that are available to you. And you need to also consider that you may not be able to compete in a particular market unless you have a particular point of differentiation. And you may need to eventually get to the point where you consider assembly closer to your geographic market or indeed production, and certainly after sales service. Market entry requirements are also ones that you need to take into account. And in future sessions, we're going to look at market entry models. So we're not going to go into any of those details today, but you do need to understand that some markets have very steep entry barriers. And those include quotas, entry costs such as duties on imported goods, much of this put in place to protect local production. There could also be government controls on the import of certain products to protect those local producers and also to protect consumers. And there might be requirements for you to set up local operations or to use specific channels to market that may or may not suit your business operation. Lots of different factors to consider, including how you are going to distribute in that market. And you need to consider things like your product life cycle, your shipment approvals, needs for quality certificates, standard certifications, etc. And of course, in-country servicing and maintenance and a raft of other issues. And on that note, I'm going to invite our experts to turn on their cameras, and we'll move into our question and answer session. And of course, as I mentioned, feel free to type your questions in our Q&A box, and we'll take those as we move through. So we are delighted today to be joined by our METS experts, who are also our one-on-one mentors for Victoria METS Export Hub members. And we're joined today by Bob Calvert. Bob has well over 40 years, close to 50 years experience in professional management, where he specialized in sales and marketing and global and national distribution within Australian and international companies. He combines his sales and marketing experience with general management qualifications. He holds board and advisory board seats in a number of different organisations, and that includes being the chairperson of the Australian Federal Government Agency, as well as state and local government authorities. Deep experience in METS and mining, so please make sure that you make the most of the time that you have with Bob today. And our second expert and mentor is Mark Greem. Mark is an engineering and marketing professional. He has over 30 years industry experience in mining, agriculture, medical, and manufacturing, and very much a hands-on product development expert as well. Mark runs his own business, Marfab Proprietary Limited, and he continues to pursue his passion for product development and export. And you have access to his vast knowledge and experience today. So welcome, Bob, and welcome, Mark.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
Wonderful to have you. And we're going to start off with some questions around selecting a market. And some of these questions are ones that have been sent through by our members ahead of today. And obviously we'll tease these out as we move along, and we'll to some extent go where the conversation takes us as well. So starting off with today, and I'll start with you, Bob. When it comes to trying to understand the customer's buying process, and in this case, of course, we're talking particularly about how miners make their decision. Just exactly how does one go about understanding those buying decisions, and where do you go to find that information?
Well, if I could take the last question first, where do you go to find that information, really is to the customer, to themselves. If they are, I group and have always looked at grouping those particular customers together. Now, a lot of people decide when they want to get into the MET sector and the international market, is, well, we'll just jump on the back of BHP and Rio Tinto and the tier one miners. And that's probably the worst mistake you can do. Their buying requirements are such that a small organisation wishing to get into that market with those customers, it's very, very difficult because they have certain credentials they require you to meet. It could be a number of staff, it could be the amount of turnover, etc., etc. And therefore, if you want to be able to use that vehicle, you really need to partner up with another like-minded organisation that already is in that, that is doing business with those organisations. So my suggestions and recommendation is that you pick the tier 2 and 3 mining instrumentalities that have a much easier and a much less formal process. So in doing that, you can find usually a way to get in. Of course, they have to have a need for that product. And that is the other thing. It's much easier to find the opportunity through that tier 2 and tier 3 miners. Once you get yourself established with those, and this is always the question, we'll probably come back to this later, is finding the need and finding that point of difference that you need to be able to find the way in, if you like.
Absolutely. And I think already a very valuable hint there for everybody on today's webinar, and that is don't necessarily start with the biggest players. Pick your battles, start a little bit further down the chain, and you probably have far more success. Mark, any thoughts from you on how one actually goes about understanding the buying decisions that are made by the miners? Would you, for example, suggest that people go and meet them face to face, or is there another way to get that information out of them?
In the past, I've always found that, going on a trade mission with organisations like Austmine and getting in front of potential clients is a good way of teasing out that information, understanding how their buying channels work, if they're buying through procurement arms, if they have a remote setup, or if they do deal direct with smaller businesses. It's good to be there in front of them and ask that question.
And I'm going to stay with you while we're talking about that all-important physical presence, Mark. Is it really that important for an organisation who's breaking into a new market to have a physical presence in that market? And from your experience, which are the markets where that is really important, and where are the markets that maybe you can start by selling into the market without having a physical presence? So where does it differ? How does it differ from market to market, and based on some of your experiences of going into overseas markets?
It's horses for courses. Depends on your product and how much after sales support is required with your product. If you have a small non-serviceable widget that it's a consumable, well, you may not need to be there. But if you have something that requires regular maintenance and servicing and lots of technical support, well, then it would be important to, if not be there yourself, have a reliable network of agents and distributors that you can train to support your product in market. In my experience, I've found with the highly technical products, understanding the local culture and language is highly important, and you can't really do that from here. Especially in South America, I've found it to be quite challenging to get things done if you're not there, or you haven't got good boots on the ground to support you.
Absolutely. And I guess that just snaps into focus as well, that not all markets are created equal, and what works in one is not necessarily going to work in another one. And just because you're established in one market doesn't mean you can take that model and just hand it over as a cookie cutter experience to a completely different market. Bob, any thoughts from you on how that physical presence is necessitated in some markets, and how our hub members and the others on today's webinar need to approach that issue?
Yes, well, my experience has shown that you firstly pick a market that is easy to do business with. Now, ideally, they should speak English. They should at least have a similar process, government process, if at all possible. And I sort of refer to the Canadians, the Americans, to a great degree, the South Africans. Those countries have very, very similar thought processes, and especially in the mining industry. When you consider, and along sort of a bit of a battle story that I've had, is that it was the products that we were manufacturing here in Australia and sending, and initially trying to send overseas. Surprisingly, it was word of mouth from the mining engineers that were going to like-minded countries like United States and Canada and South Africa, that would say, well, why haven't you tried the Elphinstone product? Why are you mucking around with this? It was, and that was a really good niche in. So not that always happens all the time, but I found that it was one of the things that made it very easy was to understand the market, in so much as what Mark said, you've got to understand the cultures. If you're going to go and take off internationally, start exporting, you've got to understand their cultures, their buying cultures, their methodologies in the way that they go about their purchasing, not to mention all of the other things you mentioned about trade tariffs and so forth like that. So that, to me, is the very first thing you can do. When you sit down and do your SWOT analysis, finding out where you would like to get your product introduced to first, where you don't have insurmountable barriers that you need to sort of break through. Now, trade missions, as Mark said, are absolutely fantastic, and they do open many doors. The other thing is too, that when you need somebody to support that product, depending on what it is, you also will find it's very much easier to find an agent or a dealer or a distributor to set up if they are in what I call like-minded countries.
Very valuable information indeed. And we'll come back to competition and dealing with competitors in a moment. But I just want to home in a little bit on the after sales support factor. And we've touched on that several occasions already today. But staying with you for the moment, Bob, when you're considering a market, assuming that everything else is equal, you found synergies in terms of business practices, language, etc., how important is that after sales service when you need to consider the market that you're selecting?
Well, you'll probably find the very first question that's asked of you when you take your new widget to that particular market is, how is it going to support it? How are you going to support it from way down under? We like to deal with people within our own countries and our own province, our own areas. How are you going to support it? You've got to have the answers of those already in your kit bag. You've already had to have done your research and have gone and almost done some reverse marketing and selling first, and finding the opportunities of where you can actually do the distribution from. Now, again, another war story I can relate to, because when we were developing the Elphinstone product and developing the overseas markets, because we used all Caterpillar components, you would have thought, well, that's a no-brainer. All of the Caterpillar dealers will just come and say, this is really good. Here's another mousetrap that we can sell to the market. Our biggest issues was convincing the Caterpillar dealerships in all different countries around the world why they should actually get on board with this particular product. So it's not a lay down misere. That's just because it might have a similar type of branding or a similar type of application that they'll just say, oh, yeah, that's fine. We'll go with this, because it just doesn't, it won't cut the cloth. You need to make sure that you have got all of your other disciplines in place. And if you turn around and they say, oh, okay, so where can this be supported? Okay, we're already we're arranging a dealer agreement, distribution agreement, support, whatever it might happen to be, depending on what the product is. And that will be a big tick, because if they think about how far Australia is away, then it's a problem. Now, if it's a software type of a product, then you've got a different marketing strategy, because you might be able to support that from anywhere in the world. But again, they still would like to know who's local, who they can go and tap on the shoulder to get that support.
Absolutely. They want to know who they can speak to when it's 3 a.m. in the morning in Australia. Thanks very much, Bob. Mark, I'm going to throw to you if you've got anything to add to Bob's sentiments around that after-sales support. And then I'm going to pose another question to you as well, one that has just come off the virtual floor. So we'll talk about after sales, but then we've had a question regarding the experience of going direct versus working through a distributor. And just so that you know, for those of you that are interested in that question and thinking around that, we will, of course, in a later session, be drilling down into some detail in the differences between distribution, agency, going direct, and so forth. But just briefly today, Mark, so first of all, the after sales issue, and then distribution versus going direct.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I've got a war story about a product that we sold into a new market, and we didn't have support on the ground in that market. We thought we could do it from here. We did the training, the commissioning, we trained all their personnel. They loved the product. They're like, we can't wait to start using it. Then they had some personnel changes, and there was a little bit of civil unrest in the area. 2 years later, when we finally made contact with them again and said, look, we want to come and see how the product's performing and check in on things, they said, sure, come and have a look. When we got there, the machines were broken. And sitting in the back of the workshop, we can't use them because they're broken. So the guys in the workshop are saying, these things are rubbish, we can't use them, they're broken. So we said, well, why didn't you contact us and let us know? Well, we didn't know who to contact, because there was a breakdown in communication with people moving and changes that had happened within the organisation. So if you're not there, you're not there. You know, you're not going to see what's going on with your product. You're not going to know whether there are issues or not. If you need to keep that regular contact, you need to be touching your product regularly to make sure that it is being used properly, it's not being damaged and broken, and that they can get the parts and service that they need. It's very difficult to do that from here.
Yeah, sometimes there's nothing that is quite like boots on the ground. Bob, there's a specific question for you. In your Caterpillar dealer example, is there any research you could have done ahead of time that would have prepared you for the problem that arose? Clearly, you made an assumption that Caterpillar would be okay with this, all the dealers, because you were using Cat products and components, but that wasn't the case. What could you have done a little bit differently, maybe, to inform that decision-making process?
Well, I suppose to quantify that a little bit more, There were a few Caterpillar dealers around the world that were already strongly entrenched in the mining areas. And I can sort of point to the Sudbury area, for example, in Canada, in Ontario. Their bread and butter was from the mining industry. So they already had a sort of an understanding that, you know, this is going to be good to get on board. In hindsight, I think the other ones that we needed to spend a lot more time was we had to actually build a training package to firstly convince the executive of those organisations and then do some very base training. And this didn't happen overnight. For example, if we talk about Chile, it was probably 4 years before we were able to convince the dealer there that this was a good product to get into. Another question that arose there was, what's the difference between going direct and going through a dealer? We actually did a lot of on-ground work beforehand with the potential end users, and the way we did that, if there was a language issue, was we actually sort of asked the dealer if they would at least come along with us, because it was the beginnings of the thin edge of the wedge. So eventually we started to break down those particular barriers. I think it's a difficult one to say in hindsight what we've done differently. I think what we did find was that you have to spend a lot of time if you're going to go into a new market and you're not sure of how to approach it. Then yes, your research has got to be, and even if it's not emails, it's getting on the phone. If you don't want to get onto a plane first up, just in assessing the market potential, then at least you build those confidences. You find somebody within that organisation that has a passion that particular product that you're going to be trying to get into their operation. They can see the features and benefits of it, and then you work backwards from there. But you'll still get that thing about, okay, how you're going to support this, again, depending on what type of product you got.
Yeah. And it certainly seems that we keep coming back to that one issue, which is an issue that I think very often we gloss over, and that is, it's not just about making the sale, it's how you're going to support the sale. And that is something that your customer is going to want to know long before they agree to accept a price. How are you going to support this thing once we've taken it off your hands? And I think that's a very important piece of information for everyone on today's webinar to take away with them. Thinking about market research now, and we've already covered off a number of different areas, I think, in some of the questions that have arisen. But I do want to think about determining demand and how one assesses what the current demand is and how that is likely to change over time. And Mark, you touched on the fact that you were in a market and there was civil unrest. You ended up being away from the market for a couple of years, came back in, and then found that there were all sorts of issues that had arisen, including changes of personnel, breakdown of communication, and so on. And that obviously would have affected as well the future demand for your product. So how does one determine what the demand is? How do you go about doing that? How do you get accurate information? And then how do you extrapolate that information and apply it to what the likelihood is of return customers and supplying future demand?
Well, a crystal ball would be handy, I think.
Wouldn't it just?
We all need one of those. Look, it's boots on the ground. You've got to go there. You've got to be there. You've got to be talking to the clients. You've got to understand the socioeconomic situation. You've got to understand the political situation. things change. It's ever moving. It's not going to be what happens today is going to happen forever. We see that quite often in different regions, particularly at the moment in Peru. I've got product on the ground in Peru that I can't get to the mine site. It's been sitting there for months because there's still some political issues around the mine site. It's hard to sort of say, look, go there and have a look, and that's the way it's going to be, because it does change regularly. You've got to keep up to date with what's happening all the time. You've got to be in contact with your people on the ground there. Get on the internet and search and see what's happening. It's not something that you can just say this is going to work forever, unfortunately. So for me, it's important to get there, find a good partner in region, or a good organization or an industry association that you can regularly be in contact with to get updates on what's happening.
And the key there is having good intelligence on the ground.
Yeah.
You can't possibly know it all yourself, so find people that can help you with that. Bob, are there any specific resources that you can point people towards to help them do that research for things around market demand, but also around issues like finding what is selling at the moment? How does one compete, for example, in a market? Any resources that you can point our punters to that they can draw on to help them with that all-important on-the-ground information?
I think you mentioned it before. Dr. Google is a pretty good tool this day and age. I can go back 30 plus years ago when we were first looking into the market, and it was very, very difficult to find out what was what. I think the industry associations really this day and age are the greatest vehicle to get in. And it's word of mouth, and it's asking. And if you're with somebody like on an Austmine, for example, having the collegiate of people that are already dealing in those countries or in that particular mine site or that particular mining company, wherever they might happen to be, just asking others to find out how did they go about it, what were the pitfalls that they came across. We have an enormous collegiate of friends in this in the Australian mining industry, in the supply and the technology sector, and that's without sort of blowing up Austmine, but it's a fact. That's really what it was about. When I first started with, we were an inaugural member of Austmine, and it was absolutely fantastic just to pick up the phone and talk to another particular colleague. And it might not have been anywhere in the same business line. It was in the met sector. They might have been in the minerals processing side, and we were in the underground vehicle side. The rails didn't even meet, but we had one common agenda, and that was to get our products internationally and to support each other going forward. It also depends a lot on what your product is, and mentioned before, not one hat fits all things. You need to really understand where to go and ask those questions. Now, there are numerous, I can't pull them straight out of the air. I know you've got quite a number there in one of the slides that you mentioned, Collins, and I think those sorts of things are a good starting point. But there are other research vehicles that you can find on the web. They will cost you money. And here again, it just depends on what volume and what percentage of the market you want to have as part of your overall business plan and your business model for getting international sales. Sometimes it's better to be able to utilize, as I said, the mining companies that are already here in Australia doing business and build relationships there. There's another methodology, and asking them, well, who in the overseas mine could I go and ask, etc., etc. There was one particular company, I'm not sure if they're still, I know they've had several buyouts, but it was called the ERG Group, I think, way back when. And it was a Swedish organisation, market research, but it was just specifically on mines. Now, back probably in 2007 or thereabouts, 2008, in the mid those years, it was around $15,000 to get a license to get all of that information. But it was invaluable when you weighed it up against what product you were selling, where you wanted to sell it, and what was the dollar value of your product. Because it's better to be able to obviously write that sort of investment off over something that might have a larger price tag on than something that had a very small price tag on. So when you weigh that up, you think, well, sometimes it might be better in this day and age now to go on a trade mission and use all of those other vehicles that I mentioned before, like Austmine and word of mouth.
Thanks very much, Bob. And of course, the bilateral business chambers as well can be invaluable over and above the industry associations, and Austmine has a number of resources that people can draw on, as indeed do others. I want to move on now to dealing with competition already in market and pricing and so forth that are all really interconnected. So Mark, I'm going to come to you now. If you are entering in a new market and you're the newbie there, how do you deal with pushback from local incumbents? And indeed, how does the presence of established competitors in that market influence whether you go into that market or not? How does it influence your decision-making process?
Yeah, I guess understanding the competitor's product and, making sure you know what your point of difference is, and being able to stand behind your product, back your product against their product is important. I don't like going in on price. You had in the few slides back about, loss leaders and things, that often undervalues your product. We always get asked, one of our products in particular, we always get asked for a free trial. I don't do free trials. If something's free, it's got no value, right? So you've got to make sure that you establish your value proposition. Make sure that your client, your customer, your potential customer understands why your product is better than the competitor's product, or what value they're going to get out of your product versus the competitor's product. I've bought competitors' products and pulled them apart. You do whatever you have to do to understand their product and make sure that you have a point of difference that your clients are looking for.
I always say to people, price is the last thing, because once you've negotiated the price, there is nowhere else to go. They don't like the price. Well, that's it. It's too late to try and sell them on anything else. You make an absolutely valid point that that should be the last consideration. But Bob, when do you get to a point where you look at the competition in a market, you look at the price points that those competitors are selling at in that market? You've had the conversations around the value that you bring, and the customer is still purely looking at price. At which point do you discount entering a market because you simply cannot afford to sell your product or your service in that market? Do you ever do that?
Oh, certainly. There have been places and customers and so forth that we've had to say, well, we've just done everything possible, and they just have blinkers on, don't want to really accept the point of difference or the value add or anything of that nature. Now, the old saying is, depending on how deep your pockets are, if you want to be able to go in, and this is another sort of a war story that we used, was that, or I can relate to, was that in trying to establish in a particular market, and you're right, first of all, the price is not even discussed. And when they start to say your price is too dear, and just say, yeah, okay, well, we want to justify why our product is what it is, right? You know, you will always pay more for a Mercedes-Benz than what you will for a Toyota Corolla. And they accept that. They get that straight away and say, right, okay, this is where we're going to show you. Now, we're not going to do this for nothing, but if you are prepared to take this product on and you tell us what the cost is now of your maintenance, for example, or your operational cost, and we will use that as a rental price. And then from there, again, it's you're really covering yourself off in your own insurance to a degree, in so much as that you've got to show your credibility and to show what your product is going to be like over and above the other person's. And by doing that, after they've done that particular trial, at least you've had an income from it, but you are hedging your bets on the fact that your product is going to be superior to the other. Now, we've had to do trials against competitors in the past, and this would mean how many tons were moved over a shift or whatever. That was one piece of the pie. The other one was when they looked at what it cost to run that particular piece of equipment or widget, whatever you have, then they can then see the value. And it might not work the first time. It may well be that you've just got to keep chipping away, but you've already cemented in their minds that you do have a better product. The other thing that I must mention too is a number of organisations this day and age will take up alliances and maybe have an alliance with your competitor. Now, if you find that there is an alliance, and it could be for all different things, but they've committed to buy X, Y, and Z for a period of years, cut your losses and go somewhere else, because it's not going to work for you. You'll spend a heap of money and not get anywhere simply because they have got these arrangements in place. All you can do is hang your shingle and say, we'll hear when you would like to come and talk to us again.
Cut your losses, pick your battles, and choose your markets accordingly. Mark, what are your thoughts regarding local manufacture or assembly?
Again, it depends on the market, and it depends on the capability of that particular market. In Brazil, for example, think to import something into Brazil, it's highly expensive. You know, there's lots of tariffs and taxes, and you know, something that we sell here for $10 ends up $40 over there. And it depends on the value that the client puts on that product, whether the market can sustain that higher price, or if you need to investigate doing local manufacture to get those costs down. Again, it's horses for courses. I wouldn't do it in every market, but in some markets it's recommended. You know, transport at the moment, freight's gone through the roof. So we're having to look at different ways of freighting our products to make it more cost effective. So instead of doing the assembly here, we're flat packing things and sending them overseas and having someone locally do the assembly and testing for us. That does make quality an issue. You need to make sure that your quality control documentation's on point and that you've trained the people. Bob kept saying before about training. Train, and train again. You know, you think you've trained everyone, go back and train them again, because people move, people change, and things get forgotten or left off. So it works. It can work. I've had it work very successfully in the past, and we're doing it again now. It just depends on the market. Pick your market.
And of course, there are some markets that have a requirement for local input, whether it be assembly or components that are purchased, etc., and local people assembling and so forth. And I guess the answer again there is, if that is a market that you're considering, that is a requirement, you have to look at your own business, and you look at your business decisions and decision making and processes, and decide whether that is something you can cope with or not. And if you can't, well, then you have to choose a different market, because you wouldn't have a choice in that particular one. Yeah. We are heading towards the end of today's session, so I'm going to stay with you for the moment, Mark, and ask you for any final observations, any final thoughts, any stories that you'd like to share about choosing a market, selecting a market, doing the research or not adequately doing the research, for example, and making costly mistakes. And then I will throw to you for the same, Bob, as we draw a line under today's session.
Yeah, so we've made mistakes. Learn from your mistakes and move on. You know, if you decide that the partner arrangement or agent or distributor is the model that you need in that area, make sure that you understand the legalities around engaging with a particular organization. A little war story, we picked an agent in a particular market. They weren't working, they weren't actually out supporting the product, and they were trying to copy the product. That we didn't know this until we went back for a visit. We were actually bound to them legally, and it took us a long time to undo those bonds. So make sure that you understand what engaging with an organization in a particular market involves. Persistence. You've got to keep going back. You can't just go there once and think that the job's done. You've got to keep going back. You've got to be there, and you've got to have a good partner on the ground that can help you in those different regions.
And understand that it's going to take time, and it's going to cost money. Nothing happens for free, and nothing happens overnight. Bob, any final observations, thoughts from you before we take any final questions from the floor?
Yes, right at the beginning of this of your slides today, you talked about researching your market and so forth. Part and parcel of that is you must understand what it's going to cost you to enter that market. Part of your research has to include a budget, and in doing that, that budget has to cover off in, okay, we found that our widget is going to have an opportunity in that particular market. And as I said, make sure it's a place that's easy to do business first. And for whatever it is, whatever product that you've got, we mentioned about how to support that. Now, that's the other important part of the supply, is to make sure that you support that product back from your own organization. Even though you might have dealers, distributors, or even if you're going direct, you must have in your budget the ability to support that product from your own organization. And as Mark said, you've got to keep going back and back. You've got to have that support on the ground. Just think for the moment that you've got your product in there, and then you've got a dealer or a distributor, or you're doing it direct. You must ensure that you keep right on top of that product to make sure it's performing, that it's got reliability, and that way the customer will say everything has an issue. Something's going to go down, whether or not it's a piece of software, or whether it's a large piece of equipment, or it's a hang-on, whatever it might happen to be. Something's going to go wrong. The customer accepts things break down, or they might fault. The ability to get them back up and running very, very quickly is paramount to make that customer realize that that's the reason why they paid that little bit extra for your product. If you go in with the cheapest price, then they don't even expect to get that sort of support. So it's a matter of balance. So I suppose the message there is have that all in your back pocket as far as budgeting is concerned. It's not cheap to export. You can get wonderful growth, but it's a small steps for the long journey.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And, I think that probably cannot be stressed enough, that you do need to understand exactly what the implications are when you're exploring a market, and that needs to factor into any market decisions that you make. How much is it going to cost you? How long is it going to take you? And how long is it going to take you before you actually start showing a profit after your investment into that market? I'd now like to invite some further questions. If there are any final questions off the virtual floor, please type them in the Q&A box, and we'll take them in the time that's left. And if you think of any questions after today, by all means, send them through to me, and I'll make sure that I get them through to Bob and Mark. And of course, also remember that you can have one-on-one access to either Bob or Mark, depending on where in the world you are and who it is that you're going to reach out to. And also, you need to be a member of the Victoria Mets Export Hub to do that. While you're thinking, if you have any final questions, I'm now going to invite my colleague Grant Philpotts to join us, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about some of the next things that we have coming up, and also some of the next steps for you in this particular segment of the Capability Accelerator program. So Grant, have you joined? I just realized you might have joined as a participant and not as a panelist. You used the wrong link, haven't you? So I don't know which Jolene you are. So I'm allowing both Jolenes to speak. So you can both, whichever one you are, Grant, if you can unmute yourself and speak, and then we'll see if we can get your camera on.
Yes, I'm Jolene too today, Collins. There's been some sort of issue with the link. We will move on from that. So I think, look, the main thing that I want to talk about is Austmine has a number of events coming up. So catch up on our events page there. We've got a very good Peru event next week, as well as another Mets Export Accelerator Program or Marketing Masterclass. Again, based upon this one, I think that'd be great value to attend. So that's really where we are at the moment. We've got a 31st of August smart mining event in at Crown Plaza. Collins and I are also going on our regional roadshow, which kicks off the 17th of August in Geelong. So you'll be getting information on that as well. So just keep an eye in your inboxes. I know some people have had our emails going to junk. Perish the thought. I wouldn't think that anything that we send out, Collins, would end up in junk. But there you go. Sometimes it does happen. So yes, just keep an eye out. As you can see there up there, we've got our market selection today, marketing masterclass, same time, same channel next week. And then 11th of August is Peru. 17th of August is our Cyber Roadshow kickoff in Geelong. We're still doing work with our two in-country consultants, aren't we, Collins, in Peru and in Canada. So they're actually providing really great support to Hub members. And again, Hub membership is free. There's no obligation on you to join as a member of Austmine. If you're not, of course, we'd love you to. Of course, that's the next step in the journey of Hub members, and you will be getting a phone call from me anyway at some stage about membership. So that's always what to do. So yes, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again on another seminar or webinar as we go. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Grant. And just drawing your attention as well to the Austmine GMG forum that is coming up on the 17th and 18th of August. So please make sure you register for that one. And of course, IMARC is coming up in November, and it's going to be in Sydney this year. So please make sure you register for that and be part of IMARC. And then I just want to draw your attention as well to Austmine 23, which is going to be really fabulous in Adelaide in May next year. So make sure you get yourself to that and be part of that as well. I just want to step back to the remainder of this particular module in our capability program. So our second webinar in the series in Victoria is on the 18th of August, same time, same place. And then we're going to be looking at the 7 Ps and how they affect market selection. Webinar 3, barriers to entry, both looking at those tariff and non-tariff barriers. And then finally, webinar 4, we're going to be looking at market entry models and drilling down into some of the technicalities and the legalities there. If you have any questions for our experts, please send them to me, and you can see my email address on the screen. And remember, all our Victoria Mets Export Hub members do have access to one-on-one mentoring with our experts rather. So if you would like access to our experts, reach out to me, and I'll make sure that you get that sorted. And just to draw your attention as well to the Austmine website, where you'll find any number of resources that you can draw on. And on that note, I'd like to thank you for being part of today's session. Thank you very much as well, Mark and Bob. Invaluable information that you've imparted to our webinar attendees today. And we look forward to continuing the conversation in 2 weeks' time. And I'm sure we'll be able to drill down into a lot of specifics as we move through. So thank you very much for your time and for sharing your vast knowledge and experience, and some of those war stories as well. It's always good to hear those. And we'll share any questions that come out of today's session with you if there are any that come up after the fact. Thank you very much, everyone, and look forward to the pleasure of your company at the next session. Have a great afternoon, and go off and do some great business. Goodbye.